Hello everyone, and this is DMT Block 4 Week 1. We're looking at the drum rack assignment that we spoke about last week. Let's just have a look at it. So we need to build a custom drum rack making use of 4 different kick samples, 4 different snare drum samples, hi-hat, toms, as well as cymbals. And we're going to go through the process in regards to adding audio effects to this, as well as assigning macro mappings to it. So let's jump into Ableton and then let's get started. So I'm in Ableton over here, and I'm going to be working in my session view. I'm going to have a look at the first MIDI track over here. As you can see, it's empty. Let's just hide the routing. And let's open up our browser, and we're going to go to drums under categories, and we're going to bring in an empty drum rack. So for this project, what we need to do is we need to actually assign a simpler device within all of these drum cells from C1 all the way up. And we are going to be assigning 4 different drum samples per drum pad. So these drum pads are obviously assigned to specific MIDI notes. So as you can see, I'm pressing various MIDI notes over here, and there's my C1. That's where my kick drum will reside. And what I want to do is I'm actually going to go to my library, and I'm going to bring in an instance of sampler. A sampler can hold more than one sample in an instance of the sampler device, which will obviously reside within our various drum rack cells over here. So these drum rack cells are now empty at this point in time, and we could obviously assign various samples and then select from 4 different kick sounds or snare drum sounds and so on. So let's expand our browser, and we're going to go to drum hits over here. This is actually a drop down menu as well. The moment you see this triangular shape, I can click on that, and I'm going to navigate to my kick, and now I can listen to various kick samples. So I'm going to select a kick sample over here and click and drag and bring it in. So I'm going to show you various ways that we could actually turn this instance of simpler to an instance of sampler. So this is the simpler device. A simpler device is slightly different in terms of how it works with sampled content inside it, but it could only house 1 sample at a time per instance of simpler. We can convert this instance of simpler by right-clicking on it to convert it to a sampler device. So if I right-click and I select simpler to sampler, and now we've got a sampler inside here. Another way of doing this, let me just delete that, is by going to the instrument section and then grabbing an instance of sampler and then dragging it and dropping it inside that C1 chain over here. And now we can navigate back to our drums and then bring in, let's say, 4 different kick samples. I'm just clicking and dragging to make a selection. Note that I'm clicking and dragging on the side here and not on the actual AIF files. So remember, we are looking for samples. So these samples could either be in a format of .wav or .aif. And we can click and drag them into the window of the sampler. So remember, we don't want to drop this in here. We want to drop it inside the window of the sampler device that we've placed on the C1 drum pad. So now we can see that we've got 4 of 4 samples selected, and we can have a look at the zone view. This is going to allow us to view our various samples. So I'm going to click on the zone over here to expand it. And now if I select each of these separate samples, you can see that we've got 4 different instances or 4 different kick samples within this instance of the sampler device. So to actually make this clear, we can actually rename our drum rack pad. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to right click and say rename, and I'm going to rename this to kick. And I could also do the same thing with the sampler as well. I can right click and I can navigate to rename this, and let's rename this to kick as well. And now that this has been renamed to kick, we can have a look at what the zone is showing us. So we can have a look and see that we can either split our various samples. These are the various samples over here. We can either split our various samples by MIDI note, which is not going to be applicable within a drum rack, because what a drum rack actually does is allocate a different MIDI note for each drum pad. So these drum pads could either house various samples or instruments, but effectively this will only be triggered by the C1 note or MIDI note. So effectively we can drop an instance of sampler outside of a drum rack, but for this drum rack tutorial we're going to be splitting our various samples via the chain selector. So the second element that we're looking at here, so this is split via MIDI note key, this is split via MIDI note velocity, but I'm interested in just utilizing something called a chain selector. So SEL stands for selector. So if I click on this, you'll see that there's a little blue bar over here that I'm clicking and dragging at this point in time. If this intersects with these darker blue regions called zones, then these samples will be triggered. So when a C1 note plays, then it's going to effectively trigger all 4 of these samples simultaneously. That's not what we want to do for this tutorial. What we want to do is we want to be able to utilize our chain selector, which is the blue vertical line over here, and we want to allocate various regions. So we can obviously select a zone region of a certain sample and click and drag it out the way, and we could obviously try and do this manually, but effectively there's an easier way of distributing the ranges of these zones equally. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to select the first option that pops up here when I'm right clicking on the chain selector, so the blue line over here, and I'm going to select distribute ranges equally. So let me do that and have a look and see what happens. So now our chains have been allocated, and we can simply utilize the chain selector by clicking and dragging to trigger a different kick drum sample. So before we move on, what I want us to do is let's set up a basic sequence inside our session view. So we want to just set up a basic MIDI sequence inside the session view by double clicking on the first empty cell over here, or the first empty clip slot, and if I double click on a MIDI channel, then it's going to create an empty MIDI region where we can actually find the piano roll. So let me double click and it's going to give us a single bar of the MIDI piano roll, and as you can see, all of a sudden our kick is available to us, and I can click on this little headphones icon and then click on the MIDI note over here. So not in the region to input MIDI note data yet, but I can simply trigger a kick sample by clicking on here to test it. So let me switch this off and I'm going to create a basic quarter note sequence. So let's change the grid. I'm going to right click and I'm just going to say fixed grid quarter notes, and I'm going to double click to create 4 quarter notes in a single bar, and now I can trigger this and it's going to play the sample that we have selected on the chain selector. Let's test this out with other samples. So I'm going to go back to my device view. So remember, we've got 2 views. We're looking at the piano roll at this point in time, and that is obviously by double clicking on a clip, whether we are in session view or arrangement view. But if I'm double clicking on the title track of this channel, which is the MIDI channel, then I can go back to my drum rack. So let me double click on that, and now you can see I'm back in my device view and I'm looking at the C1 drum cell, and you can see which sample has been selected. So let's press play again. I'm going to press spacebar, and now you can see that we're triggering the sample. If I select the second sample, you can see it's not triggering at this point in time, but if I click and drag to move this to the right, now we're triggering our next kick drum sample, and so on. If I go to the third one, you can see that there's another nasty sounding kick, and there's more an acoustic type kick drum sound. So this is how we can actually select various drum samples. And this is going to be extremely useful based on the fact that when we start sequencing MIDI information, if we had to populate, let's say, a number of these cells with different kick drum samples, then we would run into the issue where it would be difficult to, go back into the piano roll to actually reassign various note information or transpose that note information to trigger different kick samples. So stacking multiple kicks inside one instance of sampler makes more sense. And that also allows us to stack multiple samples to be triggered simultaneously. But for this project, that's not what we're going to do. And now what I want us to have a look at is we spoke about our macros in the drum rack. So if I click on the drum rack over here, I can obviously switch the device on and off. But I can click on this macro icon, and this will be the drum rack's parent macros. These parent macros could possibly be utilized for allocating a certain amount of reverb or effects on certain drum cells in the chain. But we want to actually house every single element or instance of sampler inside the drum rack in its own instrument rack. So this is a drum rack, and this is obviously our sampler, and we can actually group our sampler to house its own set of macros. So I'm going to hide these macros for now because we can get back to them, and I'll talk about them a little bit later. But let's set up a basic template so we can actually move from there. So I'm going to hide my macros, and I'm going to right-click on my kick instance of sampler. So remember, this is sampler housing 4 different kick drum samples. So let me right click on here, and I'm going to select the option that says group. So once I group this, have a look and see what happens to this instance of sampler when I group it. So once I've grouped this, you can actually see that a new set of icons is now available, and this is now labeled an instrument rack. Let's click on the macro icon of this instance of sampler. And now you can see that these 8 macros, well, effectively you can go up to 16 now with Live 11, but we're going to be focusing on making 8 macro mappings for our drum rack over here. And we can rename this instrument rack to kick as well. So I'm pressing Command R to rename it, or Control R, depending on whether you're in Windows or Mac. And I'm renaming this to kick as well, so I know what this is. And now we can start thinking about our macro mapping. So the first parameter that we want to macro map would obviously be the chain selector. So let's have a look. So we want to be able to actually use the chain selector without always having to open up the zone area to access it. So it's going to be easier for us to actually just engage map modes. If I click on map, then anything that turns the shade of green, and we have different pages of our instance of simpler or sampler over here, and we want to be able to map the chain selector first of all. So let's select the chain selector, and now you can see I can click on map on any of these macros that are empty currently. So let's click on macro 1's map button, and now you can see we've got the sample selector or the chain selector available to us. So let's go out of map mode, and let's trigger our sequence again. So let's go back to the kick, and let's press spacebar to trigger our sequence. And now I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and now we can actually have a look and see different kick samples, and we have control over the various samples. And you can house, an instance of sampler can house up to 128 different samples. So that is extremely powerful to be able to actually utilize various drum sounds on the fly. And we could also utilize automation to select between various drum sounds while a MIDI sequence is busy playing. We'll investigate that later on. But let's have a look at some other parameters that we would like to macro map. So first of all, what I would definitely suggest we have a look at is being able to transpose our drum samples. So I'm going to build 8 macros in our instance of this instrument rack that is housing the sampler. And once I've decided on 8 macros and I'm happy with how they're routed and mapped, then we can simply make duplicates of these for our different drum voices. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel again and again. We can simply just make duplicates and then make fine-tuning, mappings within that later on. So I'm going to collapse the zone area. And now I'm going to have a look and see where I can transpose my different kick samples. So let's select a nice kick. There we go. There's a nice kick drum. And I want to go to the pitch oscillation section. So this is my pitch oscillation section, and this is where we would be able to find our transposition. So this parameter will transpose via semitones. And it's always good to have that handy, which means you can actually utilize a sample, and if you map the correct device parameters of a sampler or a simpler, but in this instance a sampler, we can shape the sound further. So we don't have to think about selecting a different kick drum sample or a different sample per se. We have the ability to shape the sound further on by utilizing, first of all, transposition. We'll also look at the amplitude envelope as various device parameters within that would also be very, very useful to us. So let's select this transposition, and we could either click on map over here. So remember, we are in the map mode of the actual instrument rack that we renamed kick, and not the drum rack's macros. Remember, these are empty at this point in time. So we are simply having a look, and we are going to apply the transposition. So we can either click on map mode over here, which will turn green, all the device parameters that we can map, but I could also right click on a device parameter that I would like to map, and you can see that the map to buttons or executable actions are available to us. So we can easily map something by right-clicking on it as well. So I'm going to map this to macro 2, and this is now renamed to transpose. I'm going to rename this to pitch, so it just makes a bit more sense, because there's too many characters and it just looks neater this way. So let's test this. Transposing. So as you can see, when we map a device parameter such as transposition, it's going to map the entire range for us. So this is, at this point in time, is at 0 semitones. That means that there's no transposition taking place, and the sampled content is being played back at its original recorded frequency and tempo, but we could obviously max this out all the way up to plus 48 semitones. Now, a kick drum at plus 48 semitones is not going to be very useful to us. Let's listen to it. Doesn't sound like a kick drum anymore. So what I would suggest we start doing is having a look at the macro mapping settings. So if we click on map over here, we can expand the browser, and once we are still in map mode and we expand the browser region, which is this little triangle on the left hand side under the link button, and if I click on this while I'm in map mode, I'm actually looking at my macro mappings window. So this macro mappings window will show us everything that we've mapped thus far. So we're happy with the sample selector, but we want to have a look at the transposition or transpose parameter that we just mapped to macro 2, this dial over here. So if I click on the device parameter while I'm in map mode and the macro mappings window is open, you can see it highlights this for us. So once you start building a drum rack or an instrument rack or an effects rack, for that matter, that becomes quite layered with various mappings, you want to be able to keep track of that. So when you select the parameter that you want to have a look at and concentrate on, it's actually going to highlight that for you. So let's have a look at the minimum and maximum range, and you can see at this point in time we're looking at minus 48 and plus 48 semitones as the minimum and maximum range of the transposition. So I would say 3 octaves would be more than applicable for this mapping. And we want to make our macro mappings musical. So we can think of macro mappings as device parameters that we can easily access very quickly without having to dive into the current instrument that we are busy editing or the effects that we're busy editing, because there are numerous device parameters available to us, but certain device parameters will obviously be more important than others, and that's why we are deciding to make these macro mappings. So we are going to map this at minus 12 and plus 12. And now we will have minus 12 as an octave lower from the original pitch, 0, which would obviously be the original pitch, and then plus 12 semitones, which will be an octave higher of the original pitch. So we've got 3 different sets of octaves available to us. And now you can see that this is now set up as plus 12 semitones. I can double click on a device parameter to reset it. And let's listen. So we've got quite a bit of scope here. Let's try our first 808 kick drum over here. And these types of kick drums are quite important to have access to pitching this based on the fact that if you have a specific composition in a certain key, then you want to be certain of the pitch of your various drums. In certain styles of music, this is much more apparent. It really depends on the type of drum sounds, but being able to access the transposition of your drums is extremely important and always useful. So now that we've made this macro mapping, let's think about another device parameter that we could actually access. So I'm going to zoom out and let's have a look at the filter global section. So that would be the 4th tab in the instance of sampler. So let's click on the filter global area and let's just skim through here. So we've got a filter built in here. And we can select various filters over here. It could either be a low pass, a high pass, band pass, notch, or a morphing filter. And we've got the filter cutoff frequency and the resonance. So a filter can attenuate or remove specific harmonic content, whether it's higher frequency, lower frequency content, or allocated content based on the frequency value that we have decided upon. So a very important parameter that we can think about in terms of mapping would be the filter cutoff frequency. So let's map this to macro 3. So I've got the selected, I'm in map mode, so this is turning green, and I'm going to click on macro 3. So now I've got my filter frequency mapped, and let's test this out. So I've got a low pass filter at this point in time. Let's listen to this. So we're removing the higher frequencies. And this is extremely useful for removing specific frequencies that we do not want to access or have voiced within our various drum voices at this, for this example. So another device parameter that we can think about is possibly mapping the resonance. So let's map the resonance to macro 4. And we can go out of map mode and we can test out a different type of filter. Let's try a high pass filter. So now you can see that this is working inversely. At 22 kilohertz over here, we're not letting any of the frequency bands below 22 kilohertz through because we have switched the filter type to a high pass filter. And you can see how the curve is shaped over here. We are only accessing the higher frequency range. So we need to bring down the filter cutoff frequency. So let's listen to this. I'm going to select a different kick drum sample for this example. And I'm going to bring the filter cutoff frequency down slowly. And we could also see what the resonance does. So the resonance is going to boost at the cutoff frequency. So we actually have a resonance boost at the allocated frequency range at this point in time, around about 60 hertz. So let's listen while we're sweeping over here. I'm going to make this more apparent. So we can get some really interesting effects by utilizing our filter. And it's very easy to map. So you'll get a lot of musicality out of it, and also a lot of control in terms of accessing specific frequencies that could only be passed through in your drum rack. So this is very useful for cleaning up very, very low-end content. So having a high-pass filter is very useful. And we can select a different sample here. You could always add or subtract or change up the various samples within this rack without having to remap these macros, which is also extremely useful. So we've mapped the sample selector, the transposition, the filter frequency. So this is the cut-off frequency, this guy over here. And we've also mapped the resonance. So that is going to allow us to give it a little bit of a resonance boost if we need it. So let's think about some other device parameters that we can think about mapping. And let's move on to our two envelopes. So we've got a filter envelope over here that I'm not going to be making use of. So I'm going to disable it, and I'm going to move to the envelope on the right. This is an amplitude envelope, and amplitude obviously means volume, right? So amplitude is going to be useful in terms of accessing the attack and possibly the release time, dependent on the sampled content that we are housing the sampler device with. So first of all, let's map the attack time, and I'm going to right-click this time and map this to macro 5. So I'm mapping the attack time for the amplitude envelope, and now I'm going to go back and utilize my macro over here. I just want to zoom out so we can access it while we can actually see what's going on here. So I'm going to trigger the sample, and I'm going to move the attack time. And you'll actually start to notice that we're losing the transients or the point of impact. We're losing the entire sample at this point in time. And we want to actually find that sweet spot in terms of being able to shave off the initial transient in terms of the attack time. Remember, this is the volume boosting up in, at this point in time, 164 milliseconds. So we want to find the sweet spot to be able to actually access a sharp transient like this, but also have the ability to shave it off if we need it. And I would say the sweet spot, and different samples would respond differently, but generally speaking, we can keep this as a rule of thumb. Round about 15 milliseconds or so is a good. That shaves up off enough of the transients to be able to lessen the intensity of the kick. So really dependent on the style of music that you're working on. And effectively, for a lot of modern drum recordings especially, we do drum replacements with samples. So effectively understanding how to shape sampled content and work with samples is an extremely valuable skill set to acquire. So we want to actually access the range of the attack time of the amplitude over here. So I'm going to go to my map mode again, and let's select the attack time so we can highlight it. I'm going to zoom out, and I'm going to click on that device parameter, the attack for the amplitude, and that's going to highlight for us. And now, while the sequence is playing, we can press play on this. We can allocate where this is at. So at this point in time, we want the maximum to be around about 16 or 17 milliseconds. That would be the maximum range that we want this dial to go, because obviously if this goes past and I'm pressing play on my sequence over here, you can see it's busy playing. Let's have a look at it. Busy playing, and we can't hear anything based on the fact that the attack time is far too great for the transients to be able to be voiced properly. So we want to actually set the map mode. Remember, we need to be in map mode over here. And once I'm in map mode, I'm going to select the attack time again, and let's select this to 16 milliseconds. So I'm going to bring this down. You can also type this in. So let's type in 16 and let's have a listen to that. Let's try a different sample. And you can actually hear that transient come out. Let's try a different kick. So there we go. There is the mapping that we just made in terms of the amplitude attack time. I'm going to rename this by pressing Command R, and I'm just going to call this attack. And now we want to do the same thing for our release time. So let's find that long sample again. This will work well with longer samples. So let's find a sample with a decay, like this kick drum over here. It's got quite a long tail if we're listening to it. And we want to be able to shape this. So if this tail is too long, we want to be able to shape this. I'm going to bring down the sustain and the decay. And I want to bring down the decay time while I'm listening. And you can see that we can start shaping this to be a legato voice or a legato sample or a staccato sample. So we can actually map the decay time over here to macro 6. So let's right click, map this to macro 6, and now we can rename this just to decay. But remember, we are mapping the entire range of that parameter value, the maximum and minimum range of that device parameter, which is the amplitude decay time. So if we bring this all the way to a minimum, listen to what happens to the sample. It disappears. So we want to be aware of that. So go back to map mode. We're going to click on decay, and we want to select the sweet spot again where the minimum range is still audible. So the minimum range of the macro itself. So remember, we're taking the entire range of the device parameter that we've mapped, in this instance the decay for the amplitude, and we want to be able to allocate only a certain region, whether it's a certain region within the minimum and maximum of the macro itself. So let's listen back to this, and let's bring this down until we can hear it as a short transient or a staccato note. That seems doable. And let's have a look at the value. So 430 milliseconds. Let's just zoom in here. Ooh, that's massive, sorry. 430 milliseconds, that seems good for a minimum value. Remember, we are looking at the minimum value, not the maximum value for the decay time. We want it to be able to be legato still when we turn the macro clockwise to its maximum range. So we want this to be 430. And you can do this by ear. You can carry on playing back your sequence, and you can dial these values in as long as they are musical, as long as while you're busy listening to your sequence, you can still hear your sound. And when you turn the macro, you are hearing an audible difference. These are musical macro mappings and not just macro mappings that would, not serve any purpose whatsoever. Remember, we want to make these mappings as musical as possible. Staccato, legato. Let's repitch this. Staccato, legato. And different samples. That's got a long ring. Bring it down. And you can hear we've got a lot of scope to work with. And if we don't like that particular kick drum sample, we can easily replace it. So I'm not crazy about that kick drum sample. Let's open up the zone area. Let's find it. So this is where the sample selector is. This is intersecting obviously within this range. And this is the sample that we can replace. So if I'm not happy with the sample, I can simply delete it. So I'm just pressing the delete key. And let's find a different sample, click and drag and drop it in here. Let's drop it in the middle and let's distribute ranges equally again. So I just right clicked on there and let's try this sample. And there we go. There's our cutoff frequency. And we can repitch this. And there we go. So we've got some device parameters that we're happy with. Let's think about something else that we can allocate in terms of a macro mapping. So an easy macro mapping that we can think about is the overall volume of that particular instance of sampler. So as you can see, if I'm in filter global still, I can access the volume for the overall sampler. So there might be discrepancies in regards to the volume of your various samples that you're bringing into the sampler. So it makes sense to be able to have a quick and easy access to the volume of your instance of sampler, so you can turn it down or turn it up if need be. But remember what I said about the minimum and maximum range. If I'm just quickly looking at the minimum and maximum range of the overall volume of the sampler without playing anything, and I implore you to do this without playing any content at this point in time. Let's have a look. So we can turn this all the way down to minus 36 dB, or we can turn it all the way up to plus 36 dB. I would definitely recommend that we need to truncate or allocate a lower maximum volume. Plus 36 dB will not only hurt your ears, but possibly blow your speakers. It is not a viable option. But obviously, it really depends on the sampled content that you have within the instance of sampler. But for our example, we want to be able to access the mapping window to allocate a more reasonable maximum volume amount. So I'm going to double click on this to reset this to minus 12 dB. I'm going to right click and I want to map this to macro 8. I'm going to show you what we're going to make use of in terms of macro 7. So I'm going to map this to macro 8. This has now been mapped, and remember it's mapped the entire range. Let's have a look. Minus 36, plus 36. We don't want that, so we're going to go to map mode again, and as long as our browser window is open, we are now in the macro mappings window, and now you can see there's a whole bunch of things that we've already mapped, 7 parameters in total, and we want to access the one that we want to change the range for. So if you get confused, just go back to the parameter that you just wanted to edit on the instance of sampler, or whether it is an instrument rack or an audio effect device parameter. In this instance, we're looking at the volume. So I'm going to click on this. And now you can see there it is, the kick volume, and we want to change the maximum value, let's say to plus 6 dB. So I'm going to type in 6 and press enter. And now we've got control over the kick volume. Let's play this. So I'm going to press spacebar to play the sequence. And we can turn it up, or we can turn it down. But we've got control over this. So let's say this kick is a little soft, we can bring it up. So we've got control over the volume of our various samples. And we can easily change these samples as well, like I showed you. So let's have a look at the last device parameter. I possibly want to be able to allocate an oscillator to be, available to me when I'm busy playing a sequence, or busy sequencing a drum pattern. I want to be able to, let's say, have my original sampled content also be triggered by an oscillator. So an oscillator would basically be a device that creates periodic waveforms, the standard waveforms being sine wave, sawtooth, square, also known as pulse, as well as triangle. So these are the standard wave shapes, and we can use something called frequency modulation to shape not only the sampled content, but also layer it with an oscillator using this frequency modulation effect. So let's go out of map mode again. And what I want to do is I'm going to go to pitch and oscillation, which is left of filter and global. And I'm going to switch on this OSC button, which stands for oscillator. So this oscillator can either be in frequency modulation or amplitude modulation. I'm going to leave it in frequency modulation for this. And I want you guys to explore various device parameters that are important to you. So all of the parameters that I'm showing you, these are just ideas, but effectively the one device parameter that you need to map for this project would obviously be the chain selector, also known as the sample selector, this guy over here. You can think about all the other device parameters that you want to macro map, and you could also utilize multiple device parameters to a single macro as long as it's musical. You need to remember, listen back to the content before you actually decide on this. This is going to be used in a future composition, just a basic composition that you're going to be doing for this class that is sequence drums as well as some sequence synthesizers, where we're going to be building an instrument rack as well with the analog subtractive synthesizer, and we're going to be using automation as well to create some interesting changes. So let's have a look at the oscillator for this instance and the type. These are the different wave shapes that you can select from. I'm going to keep this on sine, and I want to listen to what this sounds like with my kick drum. So I'm going to play my sequence by pressing spacebar, and I'm going to bring in the volume of the oscillator as long as it's switched on. So let's listen to this. So that turns it into a specific tone. Let's hear what happens when we change the pitch. And we can try different samples. So there's some scope there to explore, and we can macro map this to macro 7. So let's right click and let's map this to macro 7. And now we've got O volume, which stands for oscillator. We can rename this to FM volume, which makes a bit more sense because we're dealing with frequency modulation. So FM, as you can see, this is selected on FM. And we can decide on the ADSR or the envelope of the oscillator as well. Let's listen to this and let's shape this ADSR. And that's just giving us a little bit more depth in terms of a snap. So I'm bringing down the decay time just so that I can get a little bit more of a snap out of my samples. So for drums that don't have a lot of harmonic content, like an 808 kick drum, for example, working with a little bit of frequency modulation that you could blend in really helps. Let's listen to the first sample. So this is clean with no oscillation. And let's bring in the FM. We're getting a little bit of a wood beater kind of feel for the kick drum sample, which is perfect. Same story here. Let's bring this down. That's the original kick. Not very interesting. Not a lot of harmonic content. A bit more FM volume. Okay, so there we go. We've now made 8 macro mappings. We can hide the zone. You could also explore with other device parameters. There's a whole modulation section if you want to have a look at that. But for this project, you want to keep it fairly simple and just explore the device parameters, see what they do. Remember, the filter envelope obviously needs to be allocated an amount before it actually creates an envelope that affects the filter cutoff frequency of our filter section. So be aware of that if that is something that you would like to map in terms of allocating a specific filtering But as we're dealing with drum samples, I would definitely say the device parameters that we had a look at now would suffice. You could also think about possibly utilizing the shaper, which adds additional harmonic content, a little bit of overdrive or saturation to the signal. But effectively, we are creating that extra harmonic content with frequency modulation at this point in time. So let's move on by populating the rest of this drum rack. So we've got the kick, and now what I want to do is I'm going to duplicate this entire instrument rack, this region over here, to C#1. So if you click and drag this, then it's just going to move the entire instrument rack without making a copy of it. I'm going to move it back. And this time I'm going to keep the modifier key Alt in and click and drag, so I'm keeping Alt in, and you can see this icon, it's a little plus icon, and now I'm going to release my mouse button, and now I've made a copy of that instrument rack called kick, and I would like to rename this to snare. So I'm going to right click or press Command R and rename this to snare. And we can even press Command R and copy the name, and I can go back here, Command R, Command V to copy and paste the name, and same story here, Command R, Command V, and now we've renamed our instrument rack to snare, you can see. And now all we need to do is effectively open the zone, remove the samples that we have housed here. These are obviously kick samples, and we need to populate this with snare samples. So we're going to remove all of these by either pressing Command A to select all of them, or you can select one and keep Shift in and click, and now I've got all 4 samples selected, and I'm going to either right click and delete them, or I could just press the delete key. So now I've deleted these, and now we can see we are in the correct menu, but we want to collapse the kick menu, and we want to have a look at the snare menu. So remember, we're looking for either .aif files or .wav files. These are the only audio files that we want to allocate, and we can have a look at different snare samples. Now, if you're listening back to samples that are a little bit too loud, you could always bring your cue volume, which is right here, down, and then your snare or your different samples. And I'm utilizing the up and down arrow keys at this point in time, so I can listen to different snare sounds. And if I'm happy with one, there we go, there's one. There's another one that we can make use of. And we can go through and find a sample that works for you. Now that's a terrible sound. That's a nice big snare drum. Perhaps we can find something with a longer tail. There we go, there's a 707. And we want to repeat the process. So remember, now that we've brought in 4 different snare sounds, we need to go to the chain selector, and you can see that these are going to be voiced simultaneously. You can listen to it if I click on the play button. We're playing all 4 samples, all 4 snare samples at the same time. That is not what we want for this project. So we want to allocate or distribute the ranges equally. So how do we do that? We go to the chain selector, right click, and we can say distribute ranges equally. And now we have control over selecting one sample at a time. And you could always have a look at the type of sample or the sample selected if you go to the sample window inside the instance of sampler. So the sample window is always going to show you the selected sample that you have currently on your chain selector. So let's go back to our clip view. So I'm going to go back to the piano roll. I'm going to double click on this clip. So I'm not pressing play, I'm just double clicking on the clip region. And now you can see it's populated another MIDI note for us. This is C#1, and this is where we can start sequencing our snares. Now I'm just going to place snare drums around. I'm going to make it a smaller grid value, let's say 16th notes, and let's just select our snares on 2 and 4 at this point in time. So kick drums, quarter notes, snare drums on 2 and 4, and maybe perhaps, you know, a snare on the last 16 of beat 4, so the of 4. So let's listen to this. And now we can select a different snare. Now you can hear that that snare drum is extremely loud, number one. So what do? We've got access to the volume. We could bring it down. And also the tail or the decay of that snare drum is extremely long. And we can actually bring this down because we've mapped the amplitude decay time. Let's bring this up a little. We could also decide to repitch it. We could also add a little bit of snap to it by increasing the FM volume. And we could also decide to utilize the filter if that snare drum actually has too much body. And we could go back to the kick. Let's add a little bit of depth to this. And we could start making this sequence a little bit more interesting. We can duplicate this. So I'm selecting the region of the sequence, and I'm going to press Command D, and that duplicates or doubles up the length of our sequence. And we can start thinking about making something a little bit more interesting. So let's sequence something a little bit more complex here. And we can expand the depth of this drum pattern by allocating a sequence. I'm also going to be showing you a couple of things in terms of probability later on that will also be very useful. So let's have a look and see what we've got here. So I'm going to remove that snare drum. I'm going to keep this one here. Let's hear this. So extremely straightforward, very boring drum pattern. And what we can think about now is we can think about the accents or the stronger beats of our drum pattern, and we could utilize probability to not always trigger every single MIDI note being voiced here. So as you can see, we've got the velocity at the bottom of our sequence, and I'm going to zoom in here. This says velocity, so that's obviously how loud the notes will be. But for certain instruments, the actual timbre of the instruments change based on the velocity values as well. And we could utilize velocity definitely for our hi-hats or, you know, for drum fills and so on. So for example, this additional snare over here can maybe be a lower velocity value, you know. We could also think about the stronger beats in terms of the kick drum, as I've mentioned, and we could utilize probability instead of velocity. So there's another icon below here in the clip view, and this is note probability. So let's click on this. This is also known as chance. And let's collapse the velocity. Let's have a look at the chance. So this kick drum over here might not necessarily need 100% chance of always voicing. And let's think about this kick drum over here, maybe also not being as prominent every single time it, or possibly being voiced. So probability helps quite a lot for very simplistic drum programming. And I'm going to move this guy over here. And yeah, let's bring this down. And let's bring this down. And let's bring this guy down. So now you're going to hear quite an array of different patterns being voiced just from a 2-bob pattern based on the chance of these MIDI notes actually being voiced. So within Ableton Live 11, you're actually able to allocate the number of or the amount of chants per MIDI note, which is extremely useful for simplistic patterns. So let's hear it. So you can hear that it's not voicing every single kick drum over there. And we can think about possibly a different snare sound. Now, for the snare drum, and this is where we can start thinking about utilizing solo. If I press on solo on any of these drum cells, then regardless of what we've got sequenced here, it's going to only solo that particular drum cell. So I want to listen to the snare drum based on the fact that the snare drum is still quite long in terms of its release time. And that obviously is found in the amplitude envelope section, which is under Filter Global. If I click on Filter Global, you can see that the release time at this stage is at 60 seconds, which is not applicable. I want to be able to control that as well. Let's listen. So that's obviously much shorter. So the release and the decay time can actually be mapped to a single macro in this instance. So I'm going to click on the release time. I'm right-clicking on the release time of the amplitude envelope of the snare sampler. So we're working with the snare, and I want to map it to the decay macro. You can see I'm controlling the decay. This is obviously a copy of the kick drum sampler that we've created with our macro mappings. But seeing as we're filling this with different sampled content, we want to refine this and also possibly make additional macro mappings or maybe changes to other types of device parameters that we want to map. So we can unmap various device parameters if we don't want to use them for that particular set of samples in our drum rack. So in this instance, or for this instance, I want to map the release time to the same macro as the decay. And as you can see, it's going to map the minimum and maximum range completely of the release time. So let's right click, and remember we renamed this macro to decay. And there it is. It says map to decay. And now that I map this, you can see I'm controlling the release and decay time simultaneously. And let's hear what this sounds like. So I'm going to start quite low. Let's expand it. So we've got quite a lot of scope there. Let's try a different sample. Quite a long tail. And that is helping us dial that sound in. So all of this is supposed to help us to shape the sampled content. Remember, the macros need to be musical so we can shape the sampled content. Okay, so we are going to move on from here. And now let's have a look at the layout. So we want high tom, mid tom, and low tom. And then we want closed hi-hats, open hi-hats, crash, or ride samples. Okay, so we are going all the way to the F# 1 drum pad. So let's just be 100% certain. That's not going to be F# 1. This probably needs to be G#, or G rather, because we're moving up chromatically. So this is just an error. That needs to be G. Just be aware of that. But effectively, we're moving up on the drum cell from bottom left-hand side all the way up. And we are going to move now to our high tom, mid tom, and low tom. So let's make a duplicate of the snare. So I'm going to keep Alt in, click and drag. And then let's call this high tom. Let's rename this, Command R. I'm going to rename it over here, high tom. This is also going to be renamed to high tom. We're going to select these 4 samples, remove that. We're going to go to the drum menu, and we're going to go and find toms. Let's find high. So these are high toms. I'm just going to select the first 4, drop them in, go to the chain selector, right click, distribute ranges equally, double click on your sequence that you have here, and now you'll see there'll be a high tom available, which we can trigger, and we can start sequencing with. So let's find a couple of spots for our high tom to fit in there. And let's listen back to our samples. Now remember, maybe we don't want the FM volume. Maybe we want to reset some things, and we can start working from there. So let's trigger this tom sound. Let's try a different tom sound. Okay, cool. And we could obviously also repitch this. So let's listen to this. Cool. And we can bring the volume down, and we could also start thinking about adding some chants to these notes. So let's select all of these toms. Let's bring them all the way down in terms of chants. And you can see we're starting to work within the context of that particular drum sound. And we could always re-pitch this. Add a little bit of decay. Let's try a different sample. And you can see a 2-bar drum pattern that normally would be very one-dimensional. I mean, we're not even talking about swing or adding any kind of groove template at this point in time to allocate some swing or movement, because we're just busy building our rack at this point in time. We can refine this in terms of sequencing later on, but this is just a good indication in terms of what sampled content is there. So obviously this sample over here is not going to be something that I would like to make music with, so I'm going to remove that, find a different sample. We can bring this sample in here, drop that in there, and distribute ranges equally again. Okay, so let's think about some other parameters that we can start adding in here, and perhaps we want to allocate a certain effect on a drum. So we've only been exploring the device parameters of the sampler itself. Perhaps we want to bring in some additional effects, and I would definitely implore you to explore this as well. And we can do this by going to our effects section over here, and I'm going to start exploring possibly working with the delay. So I'm going to bring in a delay. I'm just searching for delay over here, and let's have a look at the standard delay. And now we need to be aware of the fact that these are different drum cells, right? I can select every one of these drum cells, and you can see different, device parameters mapped, as well as different values allocated. And we could also see different instances of the sampler device housed within all of these different drum cells. Now, for my high tom, for example, I am going to bring in a delay just to explore what we could possibly generate in terms of the sonics of this. And we're going to be having a look at the high tom area. So I've selected it, and you can see I've renamed these so we know that this is the sampler for the high tom. And this instrument rack can house additional effects. You can see I'm selecting the instrument rack. Let's just click away for the time being. If I select the instrument rack, everything that highlights, and I can just select the name here, If I select the instrument rack, everything that highlights with this light blue color is what resides within that instrument rack currently, and this could consist of MIDI and audio effects. So we can populate this high tom with a delay. And the problem is, if I drag this delay and let's say drop it at the end here outside of the rack, then everything is going to be running through this delay. A delay basically receives a piece of audio into its buffer or memory, and then would be able to repeat based on the amount of feedback allocated. So this audio gets recorded in real time and then spits out that audio at an allocated beat subdivision or an allocated time time unit in terms of milliseconds or seconds. So we can utilize the sync over here, but this is residing outside of the drum rack, which means the kick drum, the snare drum, as well as the tom is now going to be affected by the delay, and that is not what we want. We want to be able to allocate a delay just for the tom in this instance. So we need to drag this into the instrument rack that is residing for the tom. So let's select the instrument rack and let's see. Everything that turns blue is the instrument rack. So this region over here is part of the drum rack. So if I drop this over here, that's not going to be correct either. But if I drop it over here, and let's just double check. If I select this, you can see this is not residing within our instrument rack for our tom. We need to click and drag this and drop it right next to the sampler. And now you'll see that if I press play on my sequence, the kicks are still going to be clean, the snare is going to be clean, but the high tom will be affected by the delay. Let's try time-based. So you can hear the toms are delaying, and we can set it to like something like ping pong. Let's hear this. So that's now being allocated stereo left and right. Allocate a beat subdivision. And we've got control over the dry wet. So that's just adding a little bit of depth, so you can sequence a couple of things and then the delay effect will just, repeat that based on the amount of feedback here. So now we've run out of visible macros in this instance, but we can go up to 16 macros. So I'm going to expand this, and now I can map macro 9 and 10 to the device parameters that I want. So let's say macro 10 should be the delay dry wet. So this just says dry wet, so I'm going to rename this to delay. Oh, let's just get rid of that W. And I also want to, let's say, set a different beat subdivision. So let's map this to macro 9. So we can select different beat subdivisions that we see fit. So let's just call this delay time. And now we can listen back to this. Let's repitch this. And you can hear we're starting to create a lot more interest based on the fact that we're adding some effects. And it's just one device that we've added, and we can carry on by adding reverb, we can carry on by adding echo. There are a whole bunch of other devices. We can think about a beat repeat, for example. We could explore all of these elements later on, in our lesson tomorrow. But effectively just explore with allocating various effects over here. So that's our high tom. We can also repeat the process for our low tom, but I'm not going to bore you by expanding on this too much. So I'm just making duplicates, and I'm just going to rename this to mid tom. And you could obviously like allocate different samples to this. Let's call this low tom. And now we want to allocate our hi-hats. So F and F sharp 1. Let's just double check. Closed hi-hat samples on F, and F sharp 1 will be the open hi-hats. So let's copy this over. So this will be our closed hi-hats. So I'm just going to call this CHH for closed hi-hats. And let's make sure that this is also renamed. Remember, I didn't do that with the other toms just to save some time. But it's good to rename this. And if you don't want, let's say, the delay on there, we can delete the delay effect. And then we could also see that the macros have been removed. And we could also rename this by pressing Command R, deleting that, and these macros will then be renamed just to their native state, which is macro 9 and 10. So we could also press the subtract button to remove those unmapped macros, and we can go in and replace the tom sounds with closed hi-hats. I'm going to delete these. I'm going to go to the sample selection, and rather, I'm going to go to drums, and I'm going to look for hi-hats. And my hi-hats will be here. And let's find some closed hi-hats. These are marked HHC. So there we can find some samples. There's another hi-hat. There's another one. And there's another one. Distribute ranges equally in the chain selector, right click, distribute ranges equally, and we've got access to shape this. Perhaps the attack and decay time will not be applicable devices that we want to allocate to these samples because the transients or the length of these samples are so short. Let's listen. So obviously let's sequence something. Let's go in and just duplicate a whole set of 16s. I'm just pressing Command D after I made a note, and I'm going to work with the chance again. So I'm going to allocate a whole bunch of different elements of chance so that it actually creates more interest in our sequence, and then we can actually take it from there. So let's listen back to these hi-hats. So I'm also affecting the snare. And now we can select different hi-hats. So that tom, delay on the tom is a little bit loud, so let's go back to the dry wet and make it a little bit more dry. So there we go. We've got some closed hi-hats, and it's not constantly triggering 16th notes. There are some rests, and we could obviously add additional smaller subdivisions, for example. We could always change the subdivision. If I right-click and say 30-second notes, we can maybe double up on the notes over here, and the chance, being far less. So we can double up on notes over here and over here, and that's just going to add some additional variation to our hi-hats. Let's listen. I'm going to solo the hi-hats over here. I'm on the snare track. Let's just go to the hi-hats. Oh, these are probably the nicest hats over here. So we can make this a little bit less in terms of the release time. You could obviously shape the amplitude envelope. Let's see what the attack time does. Turns it a little bit more into a shaker. Let's bring the volume up. Always repitch this. Let's solo this with the kick. Let's try it with the snare. So that snare drum is extremely dry at this point in time. Not crazy about it. So we could think about populating the snare drum maybe with a reverb. Let's go back to the effects and let's find a standard reverb here. But this time, what I want us to do, I'm going to actually leave that for now. I'm going to just deal with the choking. So when I mentioned choking over here, closed hi-hats on choke group 1, as well as open hi-hats on choke group 1, I spoke about the nature of the hi-hats on an acoustic drum kit. So effectively, hi-hats can be played in a number of different ways on an acoustic drum kit. But the mechanism that works in terms of a hi-hat is a pedal that you step down with your left-handed or right-handed. When you're left-handed, you use your left foot to step down on the hi-hat pedal to effectively close the two cymbals that are facing one another, and that would close the hi-hat if it were sustaining previously. So I could let go of the tension with my left foot on the hi-hat when I'm playing the hi-hat with my drumsticks, effectively making the cymbal resonate for longer, splash for longer, and vibrate. And then I can step down with my left foot to choke that hi-hat sound. So effectively on a drum machine, we can do the same thing. So that basically means that no two of these allocated samples on a specific choke group will be able to play simultaneously. So if we have an open hi-hat sample sustaining or continuing with a longer tail, or with a longer release time, and then we play another closed hi-hat or sequence another closed hi-hat, then it would effectively choke the sustained sample. So let's try this. I'm going to make a duplicate of this closed hi-hat group by keeping Alt in, and now I'm going to rename this to Open HH, or OHH rather, and that will be allocated to open hi-hat samples. So OHH, I'm renaming these to OHH. I'm removing these samples. Remember, if you can't find the samples, they are inside the zone area. You need to expand the zone so you can find the samples. Select all the samples by clicking and dragging or pressing Command A, and then just pressing delete. Let's go back to drums and let's find our open hi-hat samples. So HHO. So there's an open hi-hat. There's a longer open hi-hat. There's another one. But I want to find something that's possibly a little bit more acoustic, like that one. Let me just find one more. There we go. That's nice and long. Okay, cool. So chain selector, right click, distribute ranges equally. Cool. So now we've got our open hi-hats, but as you can see, if I arm this, and I'm going to go to my MIDI keyboard and I'm going to press my open and closed hi-hats, and you can see once I trigger an open hi-hat and then a closed hi-hat straight after that, the open hi-hat at this point in time is still being triggered or still sustaining. And that's not going to work for us. We want to be able to choke that sound, effectively muting it. And that brings me to having a look at the rest of the drum rack icons over here. So this is our device view. This is where we'll be able to see all of our instrument racks that we've been building. But over here is our chain list. If we look at our chain list over here, we can see all of our different drum samples, and we can trigger them, the drum cells. So all the toms, these are obviously the same at this point in time. Let's just select different tom samples for this example, so you guys could actually hear different drum sounds being triggered. Let's try it again. So kick, snare, high tom, mid tom, low tom. Okay. Now this is obviously being delayed. With the delay that we've added, we can remove that, but I'm just going to leave it for that, like that for now. We've got the closed hi-hats and open hi-hats. We could trigger them. And this is obviously the volume allocation. This is the overall volume of the chain, not the volume of the sampler that we've mapped. So you can actually access this as well. As you can see, once you populate a drum rack, by the way, inside your session view, there's a little triangular icon over here. If I just collapse this and get rid of my browser, you can see that there's a little triangular icon. If you wanted to mix your drum rack sounds as well, you can actually click on this triangular icon, and now you can see that we've got access to channel faders for our particular drum voices, as well as play buttons, and you can mute or unmute these, solo these, and you could also allocate panning parameters, so that's left and right panning parameters. But remember, with any device parameter, you can just double click to reset them back to their default value if you so choose. Okay, so with that aside, let's have a look at the choke groups over here. So we were speaking about choking, and we had a look at the chain view, which is this icon over here. Let me just zoom in. This icon over here is showing us the chain, and we see all the device parameters that we just spoke about. But you could also see additional icons pop up when the chain view is active. So when the chain view is enabled or active, then you can actually see I/O, which stands for inputs and outputs, as you should know. And if I click on this, you can actually see that there are some other parameters that show up. So now that I clicked on this, you can see receive play. These are obviously the MIDI notes that we've sequenced, or we can play on our MIDI keyboard to trigger our specific samples. So if I press C1 on my piano keyboard, I'm triggering the kick sample. If I press C#1, we're triggering our snare, and so on. The play or receive play allocation over here, C3, is the standard tuning for our sampler, which means if I mess with this, I'm going to repitch the original sample playback frequency or pitch of our sampled content. So this should be at C3 at all times. You can play around with this, but C3 is the default, so we can leave it at that. But the actual parameter that I'm interested in having a look at is the choke. So as you can see, open and closed hi-hats are not allocated to a choke group at this point in time. And we want to do that by selecting the closed hi-hats and open hi-hats together. I'm keeping Shift N to do that, and I'm going to go to choke, click on this drop-down menu, and I'm going to select this to choke group 1. Let's test this out. So now I've got open hi-hats and closed hi-hats on F#1 and F#. And you can hear, let's wait for that tom to stop doing its thing. Let's just remove the delay on these toms, just in case. Getting a little bit cumbersome here. I'm going to show you how we could actually add global effects to this, just to lessen, you know, the separate allocations for samples, but just to, or audio effects, but just so that you know. So now we've got our 2 hi-hats on our 2 choke groups, or 1 choke group. Okay, and we can do that with as many drums as we want, and we could obviously populate the drum rack with a whole bunch of other samples, not only drum samples. Remember, they could be vocal samples, they could be samples from, you know, pieces of music, piano samples, whatever you want to populate your drum rack with. For this project, I want you to populate it with drum samples, just so that you get the hang of it and you can fine-tune your macro mappings and understand how that works. But ultimately, we are going to be expanding on this drum rack later on. So our open and closed hi-hats are there. We've done our toms. Let's have a look at what's next. So the last thing that we want to do is crash or ride samples on an instance of sampler, and this will be in G, not F#1, because obviously F#1 has been allocated, so G would be where we populate this. So we've got open hi-hats already, but this is allocated to a choke group. So let's just make a duplicate of, let's say, the snare drum. So I'm going to keep Alt in, click and drag, and drop it on G1. And let's call this cymbals. There we go. So we've got cymbals over there. And that's not allocated to a choke group. And we want to copy this name. So I'm pressing Command R, and we're going to rename all of this to cymbals so we know what it is. Command R, Command V. Let's open the zone area. Let's remove these 4 samples. Let's expand our browser. Let's go to the drum section, and we want to go to cymbal. So I'm going to go find a couple of cymbals. There's a bell. There's a nice ride cymbal. There's a splash cymbal. There's a crash cymbal. Great. So chain selector, right click, distribute ranges equally, and now we can decide which cymbal we want to work with. So let's start here, and let's sequence some open hi-hats. So this open hi-hat over here, let's say on every single and, we want an open hi-hat, and obviously the chance of these open hi-hats voicing is still allocated here, so we can bring the chance down so that not every single open hi-hat will be voiced. It's completely up to you how you want to sequence or record this. You need to do both. You can record with a MIDI keyboard or your QWERTY keyboard on your computer, and I'll show you how we do that. You can obviously layer on top of that, but let's start with the cymbals. Let's hear what cymbal we've got. Just a bell. So let's play around with every second offbeat of our quarter note being triggered by a bell, and there's a probability of it happening or not. Let's have a look. So not every single one of them will be voiced. Perhaps we need to actually lessen the chance. Let's hear this. So that cymbal's obviously not sustaining for very long, based on the fact that our decay envelope for our amplitude is very short, so we can obviously expand this. So you get the idea. We are sequencing something, we're exploring. We could obviously change the BPM as well, bring this down maybe to 107. So now we are starting to think about our velocity. we can set a range of velocity instead of always triggering MIDI notes at the same velocity. And this is very important to actually get our drum programming to be a little bit more realistic. So instead of us always playing or recording in MIDI note data that obviously would have varied velocity, we can actually install this in our sequencing as well. If I double click to go back into my MIDI note or my MIDI clip over here, let's select our hi-hats and let's go back to velocity. And I'm going to hide the chance at this point in time. And you can see all of these MIDI notes have exactly the same velocity. We could obviously click individual notes to change the velocity, you know, of a particular sample. You could also hover over a different MIDI note and keep the command or control button in until you see this icon. And that is the velocity allocated. Obviously, if I click and drag and go up, that's going to be a louder or harder velocity hit. If I go down, you can see the color change, the opacity change, and that's going to be a lower volume. And you could also assign different types of timbral quality to velocity values as well if you see fit. So, but the problem is these are always fixed velocity values. So even if you sequence a pattern with velocity, changing velocities for every single hi-hat or snare drum, those are always going to be fixed parameter values that you've allocated. A fixed velocity on beat 1 of 75, for example. But we can actually allocate a velocity range so that every single time the sequence carries on playing, and it re-triggers these MIDI notes, that we could work within an allocated range in terms of, let's say, 50 to 127, for example. Then every single time those MIDI notes are going to voice a different velocity, which is extremely useful. So let's have a look and see whether we could actually allocate this. I'm going to select these notes, and now I'm going to keep Command in and click and drag. And you can see that we are allocating a velocity range. And that's going to change the way that these notes are being voiced every single time. So let's select these. Let's allocate a velocity range. We can select multiple notes and hover over the velocity, and then click your modifier key Command. So the Command button. Let me just select these again. I'm clicking and dragging. Hover over and then press Command, click and drag, and now we are allocating a velocity range. So now you can see the velocity range is, you know, the possibility between 77 and 100% velocity. Let's hear it. Let's make it more apparent. I'm going to bring this down even further. Bring these down. So we need to double check that these instances of simpler is allocated to velocity. And you can see we haven't actually allocated this yet. So let's have a look here and see. Under the volume, we'll see volume to velocity. And if we change this percentage from 0, then we're going to start implementing that velocity. And we can decide on how much the volume will be affected by the change in velocity. Let's bring this in on the cymbals. I'm going to solo the cymbals for now so that we could just listen to the cymbals being played. And let's hear how the velocity actually affects this. I'm going to bring this to 13% and bring it up. You can start hearing different volumes being voiced. Obviously the chance is quite low at this point in time. Let's do the same thing for our closed hi-hats. I'm going to bring the closed hi-hats in here. And let's do the same thing, volume to velocity. And you can start hearing some variation in terms of the volume of these samples being triggered. Now, additional things that we can think about as well is maybe varying the pitch with every single strike ever so slightly, and that is where we go into the modulation section. And this is something that you could explore if you like. I'm just going to show you this just to give you a little bit of more scope in regards to expanding the capabilities of your drum rack. So I like to actually vary the pitch of my strikes on the cymbals, especially the hi-hats. So I'm going to go to LFO2. You can see we've got 3 LFOs, low frequency oscillators, and these will be used to modulate, and we want to modulate the pitch. So we can either go to LFO1 and we can modulate the pitch over here, and we can decide on the type of LFO wave shape. This is just a sine wave moving up and down, and obviously if I start bringing this up, and let's remove retrigger, and you can hear that it's moving up and down quite drastically, and it doesn't sound as useful or believable. What I would like to do, instead of utilizing an LFO wave shape, a sine wave shape for this LFO, I want to allocate the random wave shape, and you can see it's plateauing on different values, and these values are going to be allocating modulation to the pitch. And we can utilize retrigger, and we could also allocate, let's say, a beat subdivision instead of a free rate to 16th notes. And let's bring this all the way down. And let's bring the attack down. So that's giving us a little bit more scope in regards to what we can work with. And that's just giving us a little bit of variation. So we've got volume and slight changes in pitch. Let's bring this back. And we can do the same thing with our cymbals. So the cymbals are always sounding the same. So we can allocate LFO1 for our cymbals, and we can do the same thing. Random wave shape, allocate this to a 16th note, and maybe change the pitch, and maybe the volume ever so slightly. So you can do this over here to allocate different volumes as well, and not necessarily have to worry about doing this in the sequencing stage in terms of MIDI. And we could also allocate a little variation in panning, possibly. Let's change the beat subdivision. Let's try this at quarters. And the idea really is, to explore the different device parameters and see what works for you. We could also think about possibly allocating different samples. You can expand this with a whole bunch of different bell, sounds, for example, of the cymbals. And then you can start varying these bell sounds in terms of changing the chain selector. So if you've got a whole bunch of different bell samples, if you so choose, then you can utilize the sample selector to hear what they would sound like in terms of triggering different ones at different points in time, because we can map this, and we could also modulate or automate this chain selector or sample selector. Let's try a different sample. Bring the volume up. Let's have a look at that hi-hat, this open hi-hat over here. And we could do the same thing. Let's allocate an LFO, randomize it, allocate a certain beat subdivision, like 16th notes, change the filter or the pitch, maybe the filter cutoff. And let's add a little bit of filter cutoff here. And I want to go back to the filter global setting, and I want to change this to a low pass filter. Add a little bit of FM. Bring the attack down. So you can hear, like, you know, those cymbals are being repitched. Maybe that's a little bit too drastic. And you could always go back and refine it. You know, the idea really is that this is a process based on the sampled content that you have here, and explore utilizing the different parameter values that work well within the context of the chosen samples. And I'm just giving you a couple of ideas in terms of what you could explore. You know, we can expand this by reversing samples, for example. You know, these other two LFOs, LFO 2 and 3, can be allocated to a number of different device parameters here. As you can see, you can modulate another LFO's rate or another LFO's amount. You can modulate the pitch of your frequency modulation oscillator. We spoke about the oscillator. You can repitch the oscillator. So for example, let me show you what we can do with the kick drum. Let's go back to our kick. And you can see you have obviously up to 128 different notes, the entire range, C-2 all the way up to G8, but we are just utilizing from C1. Let's just double check. C1. And we can move drum samples around or pads around, duplicate them as you've seen. And we want to now just have a look at the kick. And I'm going to make use of LFO2 for this. And I'm going to expand to add another 2 macros here. And I'm going to allocate LFO2 to a random wave shape. And I'm also going to allocate this to, let's say, a beat subdivision of 16th notes. Again, re-trigger means that every single time a new note is triggered, the LFO will be reset. But as this is a random LFO wave, it's going to constantly re-trigger at a different value. So it's not going to reset to a certain value. But for your standard wave shapes like sine wave or sawtooth, then it will reset to a 0 point crossing. So the 0 point before it either ascends or descends, you know, in terms of the LFO wave chosen. So let's go to modulation source A, and I'm going to go to my pitch oscillation only. So pitch oscillator only. So we are going to modulate the pitch of the oscillator that is allocated to the kick drum. So here is our pitch oscillator, and that is the volume allocated to it. We're going to the modulation section, and now we can apply a certain amount of modulation that we want, you know, for the LFO. So let's have a look and see what we can map. So I'm going to go to map mode. And you can see that we can allocate LFO1 to switch on. So we can switch LFO2 on or off with a macro. And obviously, this being a switch, it could either switch on or off. It can only have 2 states. And as we've seen, the MIDI note range is from 0 to 127, right? So a switch will only require 0 and 1. So if we map this switch over here to switch LFO2 on to modulate the pitch of our FM oscillator, then the 0 point, or the middle point between 0 and 127, will be 65. So we can change this, but let's just see the nature of this. So this is a switch moving from 2 points, an off state or an on state. And the off state will be below 65 and 0, and the on state will be 65 and up to 127. So let's map this LFO2 to macro 9, and let's have a look and see. So this is now on. Let's go and move past 65 and keep an eye on the LFO2. So past 65, boom, it's off, on, off. So we could change this, the nature of this, and we can easily do that by staying in map mode and obviously allocating this switch to switch on the moment I move above 0. So I'm going to bring my minimum and maximum range for the switch, so that's where we are, the switch for the LFO, to 1. So you can see when we move past 0 to 1, we switch on, and when we move all the way back down to 0, we switch off. So now we could utilize this macro, the entire range of the rest of this macro, to something else, another device parameter. So perhaps we can think about the rate, a beat subdivision rate. If I map this as well, now you can see it says L2 sync and rate. Let's just call this FM os modulation mod. So we're modulating the oscillation pitch. So let's call this FM oscillation P for pitch modulation. So we are modulating the pitch of the FM oscillator with this LFO. Okay, so let's get out of here and let's listen only to the kick drum. Let's find a kick that's a little bit longer. Let's listen to this. I'm just going to trigger it, expand this. Let's bring the FM, there we go. Let's bring this up. So you can hear every single time I'm triggering this kick, it's giving us some different information in regards to the pitch. And obviously this is mapping the entire range of the beat subdivision, which is a little bit cumbersome, so I'm going to bring this down. I'm actually going to reverse the way that this works. You know, so 8 bars of music, we'll start with that. And then let's say the highest beat subdivision should be 16th notes. You could play around with this. This is just an idea. And let's hear the sequence. The kick drum is soloed now, and I'm going to bring in the FM volume later on. Let's find a good beat subdivision. 1/16. You get the idea. So now we are varying some sounds, and we're getting some modulation, which is always welcome to create some more interest. And the snare's a little soft. But you can hear what that's doing. That is definitely adding a lot more interest. And if this is a little bit too loud in terms of what it's bringing to the table, you could just bring this down. But you can hear that, you know, through those variations in pitch. Because if we actually think about this in terms of acoustic instrumentation, there are a number of variations in regards to timbral qualities being voiced every single time a drum is being struck. based on whether you're playing closer to the rim of the drum, the center of the drum, whether you are playing a rim shot, whether you are playing a flam on a snare drum, a press roll. And obviously, the more we kind of tinker with these small and slight variations, whether it's pitch or tonality or timbre, we are allocating more interest. So we explored the use of velocity. We explored the use of variation in a velocity range in sequencing. We explored the level of chance in terms of sequencing MIDI. Again, we explored the level of selecting multiple samples with our sample selector, changing the pitch, modulating the pitch, allocating filter, cut off, and resonance, allocating the attack and decay, FM volume in terms of an oscillator, the overall volume, pitch modulation in terms of the FM oscillator. So there are a number of different ways that we can think about this. So the last thing that I'm going to allocate now before I move to global effects is the auxiliary envelope. So this envelope can be allocated to modulate any of these device parameters. And you can see you've got an A and a B section. For this project, what I would like to do is I'm actually going to be reversing the sample. So I'm going to reverse the snare drum sample over here. And let's solo the snare drum. So let's just go back here and solo the snare. And I'm just going to make sure that my snare drums always get triggered in terms of the chance. So that is chance. That's definitely what we're after. So that's always going to give us a snare. Okay, so the snare drum obviously has quite a decay. Okay, so if I go to my sample view, I can actually click on a button that says reverse. So let's click on that. We can reverse these samples to get interesting effects. And we could also map this to a macro. So let's expand this view and let's allocate macro 9, for example, to map to the reverse. So I'm going to right click and map this to macro 9. And obviously this is a switch, and a switch obviously has two states, 0 and 1, or off and on. And we've got a range of 0 to 127. So anything below 65 will be off, past 65 will be on. But we could obviously change the way that this behaves. As I've mentioned previously, let's go to map mode. Let's click on the reverse button so we can see that we are dealing with this parameter. And we want the minimum range to be 1 and the maximum range to be 0. Let's go out of map mode and let's see how this behaves. I'm just going to select this chain again. And let's trigger the sample. So I'm going to press the play button. And now let's click on reverse and trigger it. Cool. So we can do that. But if we are listening to this in context to a sequence, I'm going to bring the kick drum in here, and I'm going to bring, let's say, the closed hi-hats that we've sequenced in here, and we've got a reverse snare drum. It's not always going to voice properly based on the fact that the length of the sample, the end point of the sample, of the snare drum will then be the start point because we are reversing the sample. So instead of the sample starting from here, which is the start point, it's going to be starting from the end point and then reversing. And you can see all the silence over here. So we're not going to be able to actually hear this audibly. We can obviously move this back down here, but then you're going to shave off the tail end of the sample, which is also going to start becoming problematic when the sample is being played in a normal context. So how can we actually alleviate this problem? So let's listen to this in context and then let's tackle this with our modulation envelope. So this sounds totally out of time, not really doing much for us. And let's go back to our modulation section, allocate the auxiliary envelope, And what I would like to do is I'm going to have a look at my sample offset. So the sample offset is another name for the start point of the sample. So where does the sample start playing back? So the sample offset effectively is what I just showed you. The end point at this point in time when we reverse the sample will be the start point, and we can offset that end point with this envelope over here. So let's hear this in context. And I'm going to allocate a certain amount, and let's listen back to it, and then I'm going to allocate it. So you can hear I'm moving the modulation amount over here, and we are able to dial in something that will work within the context of this BPM, obviously the BPM being 107. But by moving the sample offset around, we can find a sweet spot that works well. And this is a very important element to be able to make use of this effect in a musical manner. So what I would like us to do is we are going to work with the peak amount. And you can see we are just moving the peak of this envelope, this ADSR envelope, the peak being the point of impact that we can now map to the same macro as the reverse dial. Remember, this is just an example of what we can do. I don't want to get you guys too weirded out, but just to show you what is possible, and it would be fun for you to explore, because the idea really in terms of your drum racks is to customize it, to make use of it in the future. So and obviously compose with it. So let's call this reverse again. So that's called reverse, and now we have control over the peak as well as switching the reverse button on and off. Okay, so let's hear this. Normal. So that's just another way of you get the idea. You can play around with this device parameter, and that just gives you a different effect in terms of reversing sounds and making use of the modulation envelope. But there are a number of different other device parameters that you can have a look at in terms of utilizing your auxiliary envelope as well as LFO 2 and 3. So that's just an idea of what we can do. So the last thing that I'll do in terms of the snare drum is add a reverb, and then I'm going to talk about global effects. So let's grab a standard reverb here. Let's make it an echo. I'm going to bring in the echo effect. I'm just searching for it under audio effects and going and grabbing the echo. Remember, I'm dropping it right next to the sampler because I want this to reside within the same instrument rack that we've created with the sampler inside it. And this is obviously for the snare drum only. So I'm dropping it in here. And now we've got our echo, we've got our dry wet. We can allocate a fixed amount here. Let's keep it time-based to make it interesting. Let's play the snare drum, and let's get the decay time down again. Nice and sharp snare drum. Let's bring some reverb in here. Now we can't hear this because the dry wet is at 0. Let's bring the dry wet up. And you can actually hear we're starting to get like a slap back. We can bring down the feedback amount. And we can start mapping some interesting device parameters. The left and the right channels are linked. This can obviously be independent stereo. Time allocations, if you so choose. I'm going to keep this left and right, in sync with one another, and I'm going to keep it time-based. And I want to just map the dry wet, the reverb amount, and possibly the time for both left and right. So that's just one device parameter. So let's expand this, and let's map the dry wet to macro 12. So that's the echo dry wet. Let's rename this to echo. And let me just do that. That makes a bit more sense. Let's map the decay or delay time, rather. That's the delay time that you see over here. We could also collapse any devices that reside in a rack or inside the device view by double clicking on it. And now you could see this is our sampler that I've now collapsed. If I double click on it, I could expand it again. This is a good way of kind of keeping track of the various devices. Things get very long, and especially when you're working with a mouse, it's difficult to navigate at times. So double clicking to collapse something is useful. So that's the echo time. I'm just going to call it echo time. Okay, and now let's think about another device parameter. I'm going to keep the reverb at a minimum, and I'm going to map the feedback amount to macro 11. Okay, so now that we've got that, let's just call this echo feed. Okay, so let's listen back to the snare drum. You can get some really nice effects. And remember, we've got access to the dry wet. Reverse it. But you can see all of a sudden that very, very dry snare drum sound now has a lot more going for it just by adding an echo. And you can even modulate the echo as well. If I go to the modulation section over here, and modulation obviously means change. We can change the way that the delay time is responding. So the delay time can be fluctuating ever so slightly. That repitches the echoes being generated from the buffer. There's a whole bunch of things. We could obviously have the two sine waves at this point in time for our LFO either be in sync to a beat subdivision or allocated to a frequency. So let's just fluctuate this very slightly to give it like that traditional tape echo feel, and let's fluctuate the delay time modulation over here just by bringing this up, and let's hear. I'm going to make it quite drastic just so you can hear it. So if this is extremely subtle, then you're adding additional depth to your sound. And that is the most important thing about this drum rack, is create depth with modulation, create depth with effects, create depth with allocating velocity, allocating probability, and so on. So yeah. Let's move on to the final part of this tutorial. And the final part of this tutorial is allocating global effects. So we've initialized some effects either inside the sampler itself for some of these instrument racks that we've created, or by implementing, let's say, the echo that we just did inside the snare drum over here. And we've got control over the dry wet, which is obviously very important. We need control over the effects. But what we can have a look at now, if I collapse my zone view over here, once we have our chain view available to us, remember we are clicking on the chain view to see the list of the drum rack cells that we've allocated, and we could obviously select them, mute them, and so on, solo them, trigger them. We also have access, so this is the I/O that we spoke about. We also have access to the sends and returns. So these are auxiliary channels that we could apply global effects to. So global effects being either reverb, maybe some compression, maybe delay, echo, filtering, you name it, beat, repeat. There are a whole bunch of interesting effects that we can think about. And the S obviously stands for the sends. So if we've actually had a look at our standard layout in our session view over here, every single channel that obviously has a send, and you guys experienced this with your templates in regards to your recording project, where you set up your A and B return tracks as headphone mixes. We can obviously see that these have global effects of reverb and delay. Now this is obviously in our mixer environment. Inside a drum rack, the drum rack also has the routing capabilities that the mixer has in your layout, your mixer layout of Ableton. So this will be a send and return just for this particular drum rack that we can allocate, which is extremely powerful. So we can think about utilizing global effects like reverb simply by creating a return track. So you can see that the S has been disabled. If I click on it, it's not giving me anything at this point in time. So I want to click on the R button, which is return, and have a look at this window over here. Now it says drop audio effects here. So I can go and grab a reverb and drop it in here. And the moment I drop it in here, then all of my elements, my kick, snare, toms, hi-hats, and cymbals, will then have the capability of being able to send some of that signal to our global effect, reverb being the global effect that we want to implement at this point in time. So let's go to our global effect, and for this instance I'm going to bring in a reverb, and we can open up our reverb over here, and we can go in and let's say grab any kind of reverb that we want. Let's say some hall reverb, or whatever the case may be. We'll find something. Let's go for dark hole, and I'm going to drag and drop it inside this window. So I'm not dropping it inside a drum cell, I'm not dropping it in here, I'm dropping it in this window once I've actually clicked on the return track icon, that little R button that I just pressed, and I'm dropping the reverb inside this window. So now we've populated this with a reverb, and you could see you could access your different chains, but you could also now access your A reverb return track. And once I've done that, now you can actually see that the S button has turned black and it's not gray anymore. Once I click on this black S button over here, look at what happens in my chain view. If I click on that, now I'm able to send to A being my A return track within the drum rack. So let's test this out. So I'm going to press play on my drum pattern, and I'm going to start sending, let's say, some reverb to my snare drum. I'm going to make my snare drum dry again. I'm going to bring the echo all the way down, and everything should be nice and clean. So my snare drum's nice and clean. I'm going to just lessen the decay amount. So nice and snappy. And there's my snare drum. Here is my send A amount. Check this out. So have a look at the input level, or the output level rather, of the return track. So now we're going to send some of the snare drum signal to the reverb. Let's go back to our reverb. Let's shape it a little bit. So that's obviously quite a massive sound. Let's shape this a little bit better. Make it more roomy. So I'm just applying some filtering. But you can hear now we've only placed the snare drum with reverb, and we can allocate the amount over here. We could also do the same thing with the toms. And you can hear that we are allocating a certain amount of reverb. And now this is where our global effects of our drum rack can come into play. So if I expand this to see my empty macros over here, I can decide to either map my send amounts to from my specific drum voices. So how many drum voices have we got? 1, 2, let's just have a look at it. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So if we expand this to 8 macros, we can actually map send A for my kick drum, send A for my snare drum, send A for my high tom, and so on. So this is just one example of how we could utilize this. I mean, this is for you to explore and customize to your liking. Remember, it's your drum rack. You get to decide how you want to set it up. Let's say rename this to send A, and we are going to just call this kick. And I'm going to rename this to snare send A. And this is going to be high tom send A. This is going to be mid tom send A. This is going to be low tom send A. This is going to be closed hi-hat send A. So CHH. This is going to be open hi-hat send A. So OHH. And this is going to be ride or cymbal. Rather just call it cymbal. Cymbal send A, and now we've got control over how much of that signal we want to send to our reverb. We could obviously rename this to kick send reverb, but we're only going to populate this with one audio effect at this point in time. So now the other 8 macros can actually be allocated to our reverb device. So let's map macro 16 to the dry wet. You know what, I'm not going to map the dry wet because the return track's always going to be wet. Let's map the pre-delay. I'm just going to map a whole bunch of device parameters. The size, let's say the decay time. Let's also think about our filtering. Perhaps we can control the filtering, the reflections, the diffuser. I'm just going to explore with a whole bunch of different parameters here. And now, while our pattern is busy playing, I can decide to allocate a certain number of reverb. So you can see we can really start exploring and fine-tuning what it is that we want to work with. There we go. So with that, I am going to leave you to explore adding your global effects. You can either route it this way if you don't want to map the send a various sliders over here to allocate a certain amount of signal to be sent to a certain destination. Then you don't have to. You can just populate this with a whole bunch of different audio effects and then do the routing within that. And remember, once we've actually allocated all of these things, let's have a look at the inside of our drum rack now. So let's expand this. And as you can see, you could obviously expand this and see that this is your instance, your kick instance of the sampler with our different samples inside it. So that's kick. This is our snare, toms, and so on. But right at the end of this list of various instrument racks that we've created, the 8 instrument racks, you can see that here is our kick hall, which is the reverb that we just worked on. And you could obviously have a look and see how this has been routed. You can see these are macros that were mapped to allocate a certain number of signal to our return track. So send A is obviously going to the A reverb over here. You could obviously color code these. You could expand these to mix them. The overall level of your effects over here. You could also stack multiple effects and create audio effects racks within a drum rack. But this is a good place to start. If you guys have any additional questions in regards to the project, just go over it, start slowly, sequence something that you could work with, and then allocate your favorite samples and start exploring with effects and processing your audio, because that is ultimately the most fundamental thing about sampling, is being able to shape the sound that you are working with inside the sampler to get the sound that you are looking for. So you can shape it through different parameters like pitch, filtering, amplitude, all of these different parameters, as well as additional effects. So with that, I hope this was very informative. Please let me know if you have any questions, and good luck with your drum racks. Cool. Cheers.